to set this up and call it good enough. Okay, class. So again, for the purposes of this, y'all are a high school level class. We've been learning about we've been doing American history, early 19th century history, and so we've gone through, just to give you all some of the background, we've gone through early presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson. We've talked about the War of 1812 and how this led to the breakdown of the Federalist Party. We've talked about the era of good feelings, when you essentially have one party, right? But now, by the time we get to the age of Jackson in the 1830s, there are two major political parties, right? The Whigs and Democrats. And Jackson and his election, especially the first election, are kind of this beginning of what he himself called the era of the common man, right? And this desire to push for increased voting rights for white men specifically, of any class, right? So both elites and lower level white men. And also he's focused on territorial expansion and extending the power and influence of the United States. So the question we're going to engage with today in trying to answer is, how democratic was Andrew Jackson, right? He styles himself as a man of the people, but as we will see, there were differences and disagreements about that. So we're going to start with a little review here. We're going to start with the crash course video.
If you are a music maker shopping for gear online, Sweetwater.com is the place for you. With the widest select.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today, after last week's bummer on slavery, we turn to a happier topic: the rise of democratization in the U.S. This was also known as the Age of Jackson. No, Stan, not that Jackson. No, Stan, come on, seriously. No, yes, that Jackson, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I just had to check my collar. Right, so you'll recall that the initial democracy of the United States wasn't terribly democratic. Almost all voters were white, male landowners. Mr. Green, that's just radically unfair. Exactly, me from the past, but between 1820 and 1850, this started to change. State legislatures lowered or else eliminated the property qualifications for voting, which allowed many more people to vote, so long as they were, both white and male. Mr. Green, so I'd be in, right? Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, me from the past. Quick privilege check. One of the reasons we study history is so that you can learn that people like you are not actually at the center of history, even though, you've been taught that. But anyway, the whole idea of owning land as a prerequisite for voting is sort of Jeffersonian. An individual who works his own land can be truly independent because he doesn't need to rely upon markets to acquire stuff, or God forbid, wages to give him money with which to buy stuff. No, he makes his own stuff, and he doesn't need anybody except for slaves, and also women to make shoes and clothes and to cook food and also make children. But in light of the market revolution, the idea of excluding wage workers seemed very outdated. The idea of excluding women and non-white people, though, still quite popular. But this defining characteristic of the Age of Jackson really had very little to do with Andrew Jackson himself, because by the time he became president in 1829, every state except for North Carolina, Virginia, and Rhode Island had already gotten rid of their property requirements. In fact, that's probably why he got elected. Right, so you recall that America's mostly fake victory in the War of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of the Federalist Party ushered in the era of good feelings, which was another way of saying that there was basic agreement on most domestic policies. The American system was a program of economic nationalism built on, one, federally financed internal improvements like roads and canals, what we would now call infrastructure; two, tariffs to protect new factories and industries; and three, a national bank that would replace the first Bank of the United States, whose charter expired in 1811. You'll never guess what we called this second bank, unless you guess that we called it the Second Bank of the United States. The main supporters of this American system were our old friend John C. Calhoun and our new friend Henry Clay. Both were Jeffersonian Republicans, which isn't surprising because that was the only political party, but it's kind of surprising because the American system had nothing to do with the agrarian republic that Jefferson had championed. But whatever, this was the era of good feelings, so we're gonna go with it. By the way, this nationalism also extended to foreign affairs. After Latin America won its independence from Spain, President Monroe made a speech proposing that Europe shouldn't try to retake colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And if they did, we would, do stuff. This so-called Monroe Doctrine also said that the U.S. would stay out of European wars. Ha 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 ha, that is hilarious. But we did live up to the other end of it. You'll remember that when the British came for the Falkland Islands, we were like, this shall not stand. Just kidding, we were like, go ahead. Right, so the last era of good feelings president was John Quincy Adams, who was quite the diplomat and expansionist. He actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. But in fact, it turns out that all feelings were not good. There was significant disagreement over three main issues. First, many people felt that the federal government shouldn't invest in infrastructure. Like James Madison, who'd initially supported those bills, ended up vetoing one of them that included a big spending increase to finance roads and canals. Now, the roads and canals did get built, but in the end, most of the financing fell to the states. There were also big problems with the Second Bank of the United States, which, is why you cannot visit a branch of it these days, but we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, there was the perennial issue of slavery. In this case, the problem started, as so many problems do, in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri had enough people in it to become a state, but despite the fact that there were already more than 10,000 slaves there, a New York congressman named James Talmadge made a motion to prohibit the introduction of further slaves into the proposed state. It took almost 2 years to work out the John C. Calhoun storm that blew up after this. Actually, it took more than that. It took until the end of the Civil War, basically. But in the short run, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine was carved out of Massachusetts to keep the balance of things. But the Missouri Compromise also said that no state admitted above the 3630 line of latitude would be allowed to have slaves, except, of course, for Missouri itself, which, as you can see, is well above the line. Anyway, this solution to westward expansion worked out magnificently, provided that you enjoy civil wars. So Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was still alive, which gives you some context for how young the nation truly was, wrote that the Missouri Compromise was, quote, like a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. Eventually, almost. But in the short term, it did mean the rise of political parties. So America was becoming more democratic, but if there was only one political party, that democratic spirit had nowhere to go. Fortunately, there was a tiny little magician named Martin Van Buren. They really did call him the Little Magician, by the way, also the Red Fox of Kinderhook, but we remember him as the worst-haired president. So despite having been president of the United States, Van Buren is arguably more important for having invented the Democratic Party. He was first to realize that national political parties could be a good thing. So I mentioned that Martin Van Buren was known as the Little Magician, and I know this sounds a little bit silly, but I think it's telling. You see, Van Buren was only the second American president with a well-used nickname, and the first was his immediate predecessor, Andrew Jackson, or Old Hickory. Why does this matter? Well, when you're actually having to campaign for office, as all presidential candidates did after the election of 1828, and you're trying to appeal to the newly enfranchised common man, what better way to seem like a regular guy than to have a nickname? I mean, if you think this is crazy, just think of the nicknames of some of our most popular presidents. Honest Abe, the Bull Moose, the Gipper. Even our lesser-known presidents had nicknames. Young Hickory, Handsome Frank, Old Rough and Ready, Big Steve. James Buchanan, and I am not making this up, was Old Public Functionary. Who are you gonna vote for? Oh, I think the Old Public Functionary. He seems competent. As it happens, he wasn't. So by now you're probably wondering, where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this? When we last caught up with Jackson, he was winning the Battle of New Orleans shortly after the end of the War of 1812. He continued his bellicose ways, fighting Indians in Florida, although he was not actually authorized to do so, and became so popular from all of his Indian killing that he decided to run for president in 1824. The election of 1824 was very close, and it went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was eventually declared the winner, and Jackson denounced this as a corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Jackson ran a much more negative campaign. One of his campaign slogans was, vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not John Quincy Adams, who can write. Adams' supporters responded by arguing that having a literate president wasn't such a bad thing, and also by accusing Jackson of being a murderer, which, given his frequent habit of dueling and massacring, he sort of was. So as you can see, the quality of discourse in American political campaigns has come a long way. Anyway, Jackson won. Jackson ran as the champion of the common man, and in a way he was. I mean, he had little formal schooling, and in some ways he was the archetypal self-made man. Jackson's policies defined the new Democratic Party, which had formerly been known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. So who were these new Democrats? Well, generally they tended to be lower to middle class men, usually farmers, who were suspicious of the widening gap between the rich and the poor that was one of the results of the market revolution. And they were particularly worried about bankers, merchants, and speculators who seemed to be getting rich without actually producing anything. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. This vision probably would have carried the day, except a new party arose in response to Jackson's election. The Whigs. No, Stan, The Whigs, yes. The American Whigs took their name from the English Whigs, who were opposed to absolute monarchy. And the American Whigs felt that Andrew Jackson was grabbing so much power for the executive branch that he was turning himself into King Andrew. So the Whigs were big supporters of the American system and its active federal government. You know, tariffs, infrastructure, etc. Their greatest support was in the Northeast, especially from businessmen and bankers who benefited from those tariffs and the stability provided by a national bank. And they also thought the government should promote moral character, because that was necessary for a person to act as a truly independent citizen. So Jackson's policies must have been pretty egregious for them to spawn an entirely new political party. What did he actually do as president? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. Let's start with nullification. So in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828 because they were not yet in the habit of marketing their bills via naming them with funny acronyms. Jackson supported this in spite of the fact that it benefited manufacturers. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool and iron, which enraged South Carolina because they put all their money into slavery and none into industry. So unlike Northerners who could avoid the higher prices by manufacturing sweaters and pants and such at home, South Carolinians would have to pay more. They were so angry at this tariff of abominations that the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify it. Jackson didn't take kindly to this affront to federal power, but South Carolina persisted, and when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832, one that actually lowered the duties, the Palmetto State's government nullified it. Jackson responded by getting Congress to pass the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. A full-blown crisis was averted when Congress passed a new tariff in 1833 and South Carolina relented. This smelled a bit of dictatorship, armed tax collectors and all, and helped to cement Jackson's reputation as a tyrant, at least among the Whigs. And then we have the Native Americans. Much of Jackson's reputation there was based on killing them, so it's no surprise that he supported southern states' efforts to appropriate Indian lands and make the Indians move. This support was formalized in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson supported. The law provided funds to relocate Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminole Indians from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. In response, these tribes adopted a novel approach and sued the government. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions in removing the Cherokees violated their treaties with the federal government and that they had a right to their land. To which Jackson supposedly responded by saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So Jackson set the stage for the forced removal of the Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma, but it actually took place in the winter of 1838-1839 under Jackson's successor, Van Buren. At least 1/4 of the 18,000 Indians died on the forced march that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Boy, Thought Bubble, you do know how to end on a downer, but thank you. But Andrew Jackson also changed our banking system. Just as today, banks were very important to the industrial and mercantile development of the U.S. And at the beginning of Jackson's presidency, American banking was dominated by the Second National Bank, which you'll remember had been established by Congress as part of the American system. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. When I inevitably fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. The powers, privileges, and favors bestowed upon it in the original charter by increasing the value of the stock far above its par value operated as a gratuity of many millions to its stockholders. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people. Stan, I know this one. It is not conceivable how the present stockholders can have any claim to the special favor of government. Should the bank's influence become concentrated, as it may under the operation of such an act as this, in the hands of a self-elected directory, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections? It is Andrew Jackson's veto of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Yes! So in 1832, bank leader Nicholas Biddle persuaded Congress to pass a bill extending the life of the Second U.S. Bank for 20 years. Jackson thought that the bank would use its money to oppose his re-election in 1836, so he vetoed that bill. In fact, the reason I knew that was from the veto message is because it talks about the bank as an instrument to subvert democracy. Jackson set himself up as a defender of the lower classes by vetoing the bank's charter. Now, Whigs took exception to the idea that the president was somehow a more democratic representative of the people than the legislature, but in the end, Jackson Jefferson's view won out. He used the veto power more than any prior president, turning it into a powerful tool of policy. Which it remains to this day, by the way. So the Second Bank of the U.S. expired in 1836, which meant that suddenly we had no central institution with which to control federal funds. Jackson ordered that money should be dispersed into local banks, unsurprisingly preferencing ones that were friendly to him. These so-called pet banks were another version of rewarding political supporters that Jackson liked to call rotation in office. Opponents called this tactic of awarding government offices to political favorites the spoils system. Anyway, these smaller banks proceeded to print more and more paper money because, you know, free money. Like between 1833 and 1837, the face value of banknotes in circulation rose from $10 million to $149 million, and that meant inflation. Initially, states loved all this new money that they could use to finance internal improvements, but inflation is really bad for wage workers and also eventually everyone. So all this out of control inflation, coupled with rampant land speculation, eventually led to an economic collapse, the Panic of 1837. The subsequent depression lasted until 1843, and Jackson's bank policy proved to be arguably the most disastrous fiscal policy in American history, which is really saying something. It also had a major effect on American politics because business-oriented Democrats became Whigs and the remaining Democrats further aligned with agrarian interests, which meant slavery. So the age of Jackson was more democratic than anything that came before, and it gave us the beginnings of modern American politics. I mean, Jackson was the first president to really expand executive power and to argue that the president is the most important democratically elected official in the country. One of the things that makes Andrew Jackson's presidency so interesting and also so problematic is that he was elected via a more democratic process, but he concentrated more power in the executive in a thoroughly undemocratic way. In the end, Andrew Jackson probably was the worst American president to end up on currency, particularly given his disastrous fiscal policies. But the age of Jackson is still important. And it's worth remembering that all that stuff in American politics started out with the expansion of democracy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed.
Okay, so I assume most of y'all have probably seen Crash Course before, right? Some of those. It's a little fast talking, but it does give us at least, you know, for our purposes in this class, you know, y'all have taken survey courses in American history. You've taken more classes than your regular high school kid would have taken up at this point, but hopefully that's a refresher and that jogs a memory on some of these things, like, you know, the bank wars and you know, just some of Jackson's policies in general. So today we're going to be doing two things, right? So if this were a regular class, just pretending it is, one of the things that I would have y'all do is try to answer this question, how democratic was Andrew Jackson, by using primary sources and practicing what we do as historians, making arguments about the past, using evidence, and doing that sort of thing, right? So we're going to start today by looking at Jackson's message on Indian removal together. And so we're going to read this and talk about it. As I'm passing this out, I want to ask y'all, what do y'all remember about Indian removal? So just that aspect of American history. Was this something y'all talked about much in previous classes? What do you know, just, you know, from the get-go about this?
I just remember hearing about the Trail of Tears. I didn't remember where, but I guess the video kind of explained it, how they took the Indians from Georgia and they moved them all to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And it was like so many people just died.
Okay, so you remember that, you know, most of us at least remember that the Trail of Tears is associated with Indian removal, right? And this is something that took place where Indians from the east were moved west to Oklahoma. Did y'all know that Russellville is actually a passing point for the Trail of Tears? So if you go over to Lake Dardanelle, there's a little sign that's like Cherokee Crossing and stuff like that. It's actually written in the Cherokee alphabet, which is kind of cool. I don't know if y'all have seen it. It's a little road sign just actually like going over the Causeway Bridge thing on the other side of town. But interesting to look at if you've never seen the Cherokee dialect. Did y'all recall, or did y'all ever learn anything about Cherokee resistance to these policies of removal and their fight with Georgia over sovereignty, like land sovereignty and those sorts of things? Is that something y'all went into any detail on? So if you're interested in that, this is a plug for next semester. I'm teaching a class on the early republic that's online, and one of the books that we're going to be reading is about Indian removal, and it's about the struggle between Andrew Jackson and John Ross, who was the chief, the principal chief, like the president essentially of the Cherokee Nation. And so I think what the Cherokee did in particular, before we get into the source, is really kind of remarkable, because their strategy of resistance was different than other groups. While other tribes tried to fight in some cases, so you have like the Red Sticks War, you have the Creek fighting and groups like that, the Cherokee took a more peaceful, democratic form of resistance. So what they tried to do is use the mechanisms of democracy and of the United States to essentially check all the boxes to maintain their land, right? Which spans, I don't have a map, but probably should have, but spans, a good portion of the southeast, so parts of Georgia and Tennessee, even up into a little bit of West Virginia and some of Alabama. Like that area is traditionally Cherokee country. And so one of the things that they did is they reorganized, instead of being a series of towns and you have like Upper Town Cherokee and Lower Town Cherokee, they organized into a nation, right? They called themselves the Cherokee Nation and formed a capital. So just like Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, they formed and created a new capital city called New Echota I believe in Tennessee. Could be, I'm blanking on if it's Tennessee or Georgia. I think it's Tennessee. But they created this town called New Echota, where they had a judiciary, they had a legislature, they elected a president, John Ross. Sound familiar to American, the system of American government. They did things like develop their own alphabet, which is why I suggest, if you get a chance, if you drive by, just glance at it, or you can even stop and look at what the Cherokee language looks like. They developed their own written language, which hadn't been done before in that part of the world. We could go back to like the Aztecs and the fact that they had pictographs and a form of written language from that, all the way back to the 1500s. But the Cherokee developed their own language. They developed a printing press, right, that they could actually print a newspaper and formal government documents, important documents, in both written Cherokee and in English, so publishing bilingually to make sure that everybody could read and understand this stuff. They also, interestingly enough, as part of their history, adopted even more formally practices of slavery and African enslavement to align themselves with the South, because by this point, Southern elites saw planters as the highest class of people, right? As sophisticated, as having wealth, and being sort of the pinnacle of Southern society. And so many prominent Cherokees began engaging in the trading of African slaves, and even more complicated patterns of sometimes intermarrying, fathering children. There's a really good book on this if you're interested in reading more, by Tia Miles, M-I-L-E-S, called The Ties That Bind. It's about a Cherokee family, like an Afro-Cherokee family that's very complicated, because this warrior ends up like owning this black woman as a slave and fathers children with her. Then he frees her and makes her his wife, and then has additional children. So you've got some children that are technically slaves and some that are technically free that are Afro-Cherokee. It's a really interesting family study. But all this to say that the Cherokee regularly are sending delegations to Congress. They're meeting with congressmen. They're working with missionaries too, and aligning themselves with Methodism in particular, and even the Baptist Church, to try to bring missionaries in to sort of put on, in many ways, this very public face of supporting American values, Christianity, politics, that sort of thing. Now, if you get outside of New Echota to like the further away parts of Cherokee country, they're a lot more traditional and not as Christian, and living the way that they had for hundreds of years. But the Cherokee put on this really concerted effort to show that they had checked all these boxes for civilization, right? Which is partly where you get this idea of this designation of civilized tribes, right? You've all heard that before, that certain tribes, like the Cherokee and the Choctaw, are the civilized tribes. Part of this is because the Cherokee engaged in a phenomenal effort to sort of meet all the requirements, to face any objection that could be made to the idea that they were not civilized and that they deserved to be on their land. That they owned this land, they worked it, they farmed it just like Americans did. They had a system of government. They weren't backwards savages, to use language that would have been used at that time, but they were, they were a civilization. And so, so keep that in mind as we're reading this speech on Indian removal, because the Cherokee have been doing a lot of work, right? Decades worth of work to resist efforts to remove them, and then also to shore up the idea that this is their land and they belong here. And so we're going to look at how Jackson approached that with this excerpt from his speech. So take a minute or two and just read through this. And this is your copy, so feel free to make any notations on that if you want to underline key terms or passages you think are important. If you want to jot down any little notes or responses to that, go ahead and do that. But we're going to take a couple of minutes to read through this source. Another minute or so to finish up just reading through Jackson's message to Congress here. So, well, when we're reading this or any historical document, I think it can be helpful to use an acronym for some of the things to keep in mind when you're analyzing them. This is taken from whenever I used to teach AP history, because we use this. So if you've taken a form of AP US or AP World History, there's a few different acronyms that are often used, but this is the one that I used to use whenever I taught that, because it gives you 4 important things to look for whenever you are when you're reading a primary source, right? And so the first thing is to think about, and it's HIP. So the first thing to think about is historical context. Like, what else is going on outside of this document that can help you understand this or better interpret it, right? Another thing to think about is the intended audience. So who is the author of a source speaking to, and how does that influence their messaging, the information that's included within it, those sorts of things. The first P is for purpose. So what is the author's purpose in writing this? This can be related to the audience, but this is thinking more about the author in particular. What is the author doing or hoping to accomplish? And then the last one is point of view. So how do things like the author's particular point of view from the time that they're writing from, so their status, their class, gender, anything about their background and what makes them who they are, that could be really helpful to interpreting and understanding this source. So let's talk about what y'all read here first. So before we get into some of these questions, is there anything that stood out in Jackson's speech that resonated with you, that you marked, you thought was interesting or important, or might help us answer this question about Jackson and his approach to democracy?
I don't know, I'm kind of comparing it with how politicians would speak today.
Okay.
He's deliberately telling you what he's trying to do here, where I feel like today's politicians would say it in a more subtle way, like when he's saying like, we're trying to get the Indians away from the whites and make it where they want to have contact with people, and that just stood out to me.
That stood out to you. You see that as more like frank, like he's being like,
being frank, where like I don't know if they're sending more money, if they're going to send more money to Ukraine, they might talk about it in a, try not to. They're not going to flat out say we're going to send this much money to Ukraine. They're going to try to sugarcoat it.
okay. I got what you're saying. Yeah, I think you could see it that way, but it's interesting because to me, I can also look at that and see it as, there's a little bit of a dodge going on in that too, because, he's like, oh, we're doing this to keep them safe, but, some of these clashes and stuff that have been going on for decades before this are from white squatters. Like, in the case of like the Cherokee in Georgia, they famously were sort of given, essentially the federal government, they complained to the government about the fact that there are white squatters coming in. And it's one of the really more dangerous political moves that Ross made early on in his career, because they're writing to, their delegates are going to Congress, they're like, what do we do about this? And essentially, Congress doesn't help them, right? They're like, that's really kind of your problem, but since you're sovereign, you're responsible for taking care of that. And so what Ross did is he mobilized the Cherokee Mounted Cavalry, which was a military unit they had developed from fighting in alliances with the U.S. against other native groups like the Creeks. And they mobilized this unit and went to a lot of these squatter houses, with like essentially like a military contingent, and physically removed these people. Like, they forced them, they're like, you're on our territory. They had the people take what they could carry, burn the houses down, and physically remove them. And so, they're acting the same way that, people would deal with squatters today in terms of like getting them out and denying them access to the property and stuff like that. But there's a lot of this violence that's been going on due to white expansion and white encouragement. And so, this idea of, oh, we're doing this to protect them kind of ignores like some of the nuances of what have been going on throughout this area. Yeah, Jace, what are you saying?
Just to add on to that, he kind of paints them in a way as if they're being like intolerant, or paints them as if like they're the issue, like we're not doing anything for them, they're just being so,
It's like, what can we do? They're these savage, backwards people, and this is for their good, kind of thing.
Yeah, he kind of like just completely ignores like you said, the nuance and the consequences. Like he's being mad at them for reacting to things that the U.S. is doing to them, and he kind of painting them in that sense that, like, you know, they're so intolerant of us, you know, when reality,
Yeah.
you know, kind of should be.
What else stands out, or what else stood out to y'all?
I think to add on to that, I kind of circled a short little sentence or paragraph here. It's on the first page, in like the very middle. It says, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and raised by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, prosperous farms," and it keeps going. It just kind of shows like he kind of like discredits anything you said the Cherokee have been making
Yeah.
movements on, but they're trying to be the picture of civilized for them, but he's just still not seeing that way at all.
Yeah.
He's like, they're not credible at all.
Sure, right, and he's playing into, like, by this point, most Americans kind of, especially in the East, right, so especially for Eastern areas, like the Northeast and in others, you've already seen this development of, like, this idea of the vanishing Indian, that indigenous people are forced out, there's violence and conflict, they often sort of vanish or disappear, which discounts the fact that many of them still live in these little communities and pockets around places like New England, which is the area I'm more familiar with, and Ohio and some of these other areas. They're still there, but there's this notion that the idea of, like, these tribes, like, naturally sort of vanish with the coming of civilization because they don't integrate, right? So he's playing on some of these ideas. And the fact that, realistically, most Americans don't know what's going on in Cherokee country, right? They're using their alliances with missionaries and with some of these other people to spread word. And so a lot of times they're sending stories to these missionary newspapers that are being read by white Methodists and white Baptists to help sort of get the word out about what they're doing and what their struggle is like. But that's not all Americans, right? There's a lot of Americans who would hear Jackson's words and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Who wouldn't prefer these cities? Because Native people are, don't live like that. They don't look like us. Their society looks different. So, he definitely is playing to some of these audience assumptions about Native people, right? He's playing to some ideas that have become pretty embedded in popular culture at this point about Native people and whether or not they can coexist with them and what happens as white expansion occurs, right? The tendency is for them to be pushed out and vanish and stuff like that. So Jackson's kind of playing on that. Anything else that stood out in the document? When you think about things like the context, the audience, purpose, point of view, that sort of thing.
In this last little paragraph, he's kind of again trying to justify me. He says it's supposed that the long-lived savage is a stronger attachment to his own than a settled, civilized Christian. So he's thinking, these nomadic peoples, they're used to moving.
Mm-hmm.
That they, just moving a little bit further won't be a big deal. Where a settled person is not going to want to leave their home.
Mm-hmm.
So another way to justify it.
Sure, right? And again, like when we think about this, the outside context, this discounts the fact that, most Cherokee, or at least Ross and many of the Cherokee living in and around New Echota would say, we are settled, we are civilized, we are Christian, right? I mean, there's this juxtaposition between the image that Jackson's painting of what Native people look like and how Native people themselves would describe, where they live and how they live and that sort of thing. So it's interesting kind of what's going on there, right? And I think the purpose is clear, right? Jackson is really trying to get support from Congress to carry out this policy and sort of end this question of whether indigenous people are going to live east of the Mississippi or not, right? And he really wants to get them all out of there, and part of that's from his background, right? And he's famous as an Indian fighter and for being involved in things like the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and some of these other major conflicts with Southern Indians, So he doesn't have the highest opinion of indigenous people, right? He'll use them as allies if it's helpful, right? So for instance, the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812, y'all familiar with that? There's a big attack on New Orleans technically after the war ends, and Jackson and these soldiers from Kentucky and Tennessee supposedly repel the British. They give them this huge defeat, but that ignores the fact that many of the defenders who build the earthworks, who actually pick up guns and fight, are free blacks, enslaved blacks, indigenous people who are there and around New Orleans. So it's really like a huge collaboration between all the different people that live in and around New Orleans to defend the city. But Jackson and some of these white soldiers from the kind of south central part of the country really make this about them, and they diminish and downplay the accomplishments and the roles that non-whites played in that battle. But that's what makes Jackson famous. That's what puts him on the map, is winning that battle, even though technically it was fought after the war was formally ended, which is kind of funny. So now we're going to shift to the last part of class. We'll do a few minutes of this just and then conclude the recording. I'm going to pass out this document. It's a collection of primary sources. So I'd like you to work with a partner on this as we prepare to get ready to write our individual essays, which we would be doing tomorrow in a regular class setting. So what you have here is, on the front page, this question of how democratic was Andrew Jackson? That's the core thing that we're going to try to be answering. And you've got some instructions here in terms of what is in this packet. We've got 11 different documents here, so more than you maybe have seen before in a collection, but they give you a snapshot of Jackson on a variety of different issues. So the first one you have, this is the first set of documents you have the issue of Jackson and whether or not he's giving power to the common man. The second set of documents revolves around his fight with Nicholas Biddle and the National Bank, which we heard a little bit about in the video. You've got a couple documents related to the spoils system, and then a couple related to Native Americans and his relations with those. So what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes and read through these documents. You don't have to read the background essay, although that could be helpful. But looking at the documents, I'd like you to take some notes on those as well. Maybe starting with this worksheet I have gives you space to take down some notes for 5 of these documents. So you might pick the 5 that you think are the most important. And it gives you some space to take notes on those as you're reading. So read those documents and work with your partner for a few minutes to start kind of talking about them and sort of how they help you answer this question of how democratic was Jackson. So we'll take a few minutes to read through those, or get started working on those. We may actually need more time in the next class period, just with the background and how long that kind of took me to go through that. But we'll start with that.